minutes, 5 seconds, and counting. Mark. Mission start. T0. Launch commit lights are correct. There she goes.
Houston, we have a podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for an on-camera version of Houston We Have a Podcast. We're going to be talking with flight directors Rick LeBrode and Judd Freeling today about what it's like in mission control for an Artemis mission, specifically for Artemis 1. Gentlemen, thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having us.
Cool, awesome. Let's get right into it. I wanted to talk mainly about the Artemis mission. We're going to dive into the operations inside mission control, but first I want to understand a little bit more about you, your history, and what got you into this position. Rick, we'll start with you. I know you have a lot of experience with shuttle and some other stuff as well.
Yeah, well, I started actually this end of this month. It'll be 36 years I've been working in mission control. I started as a shuttle flight controller in the instrumentation and communications officer position. We have that same position in the Artemis program now.
Cool.
And it was basically the comm guy. So responsible for all the communications with the shuttle. That's the audio, the telemetry, the commands, and video. So I did that for 13 years. I was a contractor, and then I was just at the right spot at the right place in my career at the right time, and they opened up selections to flight directors to contractors. So I applied, and I was selected as the first contractor flight director. When I joined the office, then I became a civil servant. And when my class had 4 in it, and 2 of us went ISS, 2 of them went shuttle. So I started off on the ISS side, and I did about the first half of the assembly sequence as a ISS flight director, and then I transferred over and was certified as a shuttle flight director, and did the last half of the assembly sequence on the shuttle side. And because I was considered one of the more veteran flight directors in the office, I was able to I worked the last 3 shuttle flights.
Very cool. Yeah. Very cool. From the shuttle end.
Right.
Okay, very cool. So how does that time, you look back on it now, working with International Space Station, working with shuttle, what are some of the things you're pulling from that?
it was great. I mean, just becoming a flight director is an amazing experience to start with. But and then going ISS, and I started in 98, so it was just before we started the assembly sequence for the International Space Station. And I was fortunate when we launched the Expedition 1 crew, I was actually the flight director resident in Moscow, in the control center in Moscow. So it was a completely different culture, but it was really enlightening to see how the Russian flight control team operates. It's we're very similar, and it's a technical job, and communications are paramount. So in that regard, they are very similar to what we do. But the culture is very different than anything I experienced before. So I really enjoyed that part of it.
But that's a big part of, especially being an International Space Station flight controller, right? It's not a one mission control kind of thing. It's called an International Space Station for a reason.
Right. Yeah, it's a challenge, right? There's challenges that come with it. There's pros and cons, like everything, right?
Yeah.
They bring a lot to the table. They had a lot of experience in stations, right, with their Mir space station, and their experience really they brought a lot to the table. And we do things differently, but it was just great to have each other to lean on. So it was really a good experience.
At what point did they call on you to say, "Hey, Rick, we'd like you to start working on Artemis now"?
That was pretty good too. So it was towards the end of it was probably 2008. So it was actually Constellation then.
Wow.
Right? Yeah, so Ares and Orion was still there. But we had an individual in our office that was Prime, and he'd been a flight director for a while, so they wanted to give someone else offload. It was getting really busy, so they wanted to offload some of his work, and they asked me to help him out. So I started doing that, and then he left the office, so I became Prime, and then it was shortly after that Constellation was canceled, but Orion survived, and then they came the Artemis program, and so I've been involved ever since, and it's
with different forms of what is a moon mission. or exploration.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So I've seen it all.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's been really neat.
Awesome. Well, we're going to get into a lot of, what goes behind that, what you have been planning since 2008 when it comes to a moon mission. We'll get into that. Judd, I want to learn about your experience that led you to this Artemis role.
Sure. So I started actually a year before Rick got selected as a flight director.
Oh.
So
As a flight controller?
I was a flight controller
Okay.
is where I started. I started in the International Space Station, so I was a flight controller. I did the command and data handling portions, all the onboard computers. We put a program together to kind of do multiple positions. I did that where not only did I watch over the computers of the space station, but also the attitude control determination system and also the comm system of the station. I did that for about 7 years or so in the station. Then I had an opportunity to become a civil servant to work on the shuttle side. So I was a shuttle flight controller in the DPS area, the data processing system. So it's basically the computers on the shuttle network. So I got to be an asset entry flight controller for shuttle and the DPS officer. So I did that a few years, even got to work the last missions as shuttle was retiring. And after the shuttle retired is when I got selected to be a flight director. So that was 2011. And I've been a flight director for space station ever since.
Very cool. Now, how do you compare those two roles? For those that might not be familiar, is you were a flight controller for a long time. Now you become a flight director. So what are the responsibilities that you assume?
Yeah, when you're a flight controller, really what you're focused specifically on the system that you're controlling, right? So, for instance, when I was in charge of the computers, and so I had a real detailed knowledge of all the computer systems and how failures might manifest. How they kind of how they fit in with the other systems. But as a flight director, you're really looking at all of the systems and how they integrate together, and you're really more on track with how you can use those systems to perform your mission, right? And how you can bring the team together. What are the mission objectives, and know a little bit about a lot.
Now you have to do it for Artemis. So when did you get the call that says, "Hey, we want you to move away from station and start doing more moon missions"?
Yeah, so I had completed a stint as an increment lead flight director for the station, and was starting to get other lead assignments. So I'd had a couple of spacewalks that I led, and cargo vehicle missions that I led, and they were looking for, well, we have an area where we need you to provide some help to our asset entry flight director at the time, Tony Sakachi, and so I became his backup, and started learning from him, kind of what is this Artemis 1 mission all about, and that was really in the development phase when we were really trying to psych out all the mission rules, how are we going to put this whole thing together? What are the limitations of the rockets, and what's the limitation of the capsule? Those kinds of things. Not too long after that, I think it was maybe a year or so after I was Tony's backup, he retired, oh. and so then I was a little bit got of a field promotion.
Filled in, perfect.
Right. Yeah.
It sounds like you mentioned lead. You were lead increment, lead for spacewalks, for cargo missions. Sounds like that's a little bit different. As a flight director, you're the lead in the room, but now it sounds like there's a little bit more that goes to being a lead for a certain part of what is the International Space Station missions. What goes into being a lead?
Yeah, so just like Rick is the lead for Artemis 1, we have leads for various dynamic missions in the space station as well, right? So things that take a little bit more planning and a little bit more coordination than just your average day-to-day life on the station, right? So we assign leads to those a little bit more dynamic phases. So spacewalks is a really good example. There's a lot of intricate planning and detailed, coordination among the different team members that you really need somebody to kind of, honcho and help pull together and lead. And so that's what we assign that. So cargo missions is another great example. There's multiple different teams from multiple centers, that we need to make sure that we're all, looking at the same sheet of music.
Got it.
Essentially.
So Rick, from your lead position of Artemis, what responsibilities, aside from sitting in mission control and actually being the flight director for, whatever your shift is, what are the lead responsibilities that you're helping out with?
Yeah, I think, and this goes for any lead role, whether it be for an increment, an ISS, or a cargo mission, or Artemis, is the lead is really ultimately responsible for building the mission and then executing it. And that's you interface with the programs, with ESD, the Exploration Systems Division at headquarters. They provide us the mission objectives, the mission priorities that they want us to go and accomplish. And then we take those, we build a plan, then we train to that plan, and then we go and execute that plan. So, and it's a constant back and forth. So the lead is the point person really that's interfacing with the up and out, and then conveys it down and in, and works with the various piece parts to build that plan, and then go and train it, and then execute it.
So essentially, it sounds like it's like a high-level plan first. Like the goal is we want to put, human boots on the moon. That's what we want to do. And you're saying, here's how we get there from an operational perspective.
Yeah.
Here's what we need to accomplish. Here's what we need to verify to get to that goal.
Yeah, they rely on us to actually put together the mission to achieve their mission objectives.
That's it. Okay. Now let's dive into mission control. So what do you do? So there's a lot of different pieces to this. This is specifically about when it comes to an Artemis mission, what are you doing in mission control? So the grander picture, Judd, I'll go to you. The grander picture when it comes to an Artemis mission, what is the responsibility, what is the purpose of mission control?
Essentially to be responsible for all of the execution of that mission, that particular mission. So whether that be uplinking plans to do burns, whether that be coordinating all the communication requirements, things like that. That's essentially what mission control does, is it controls the vehicle. And so we do that a number of different ways. We talked about a little bit, being a flight controller versus a flight director. We divide the vehicle up into different systems, and so each one of those systems we represent with a flight controller, right? So one of those systems could be the computer systems, one of them could be the communication systems, one of them could be the navigation systems, one of them eventually will be the environmental systems when we put humans on Artemis, thermal systems. And so we look to each one of those flight controllers to advise us on, hey, what's going on with that system? How best can we complete our mission objectives based on conditions that we've encountered.
Got it. Now, Rick, taking everything that Judd just said, for Artemis 1, what is that mission that you guys are controlling? What is Artemis 1?
Yeah. So the biggest thing with Artemis 1, our primary objective really is to test the vehicle, validate its capability before we put the astronauts on it on Artemis 2. So we have, we're building, and we're still doing it right now. We're building the timeline that's going to include just operating the systems to understand how they're going to perform in the cislunar environment or during accident entry for Judd's team. They've done testing, so we have a feel for how the system's going to operate. Testing at Plumbrook, where they do a thermal vacuum, they bring it all the way down to vacuum, they heat it, they cool it. And so we see how the system's responded in the test, but it's a different environment when you leave low Earth orbit and you're heading to the moon. So we're building a timeline, a mission plan, a flight plan that's going to just test all the various systems, and each of the disciplines that Judd spoke of, they are responsible for their systems and operating it and doing these we call them detailed flight test objectives or flight test objectives, operating the system to see how it's going to operate, how it's going to function, and just we're following the timeline. Now, a big piece about the mission control also is when things don't go as planned for whatever reason, we run into something we didn't expect, then we have to replan, we re-timeline, we may move, hey, that didn't turn out the way we planned it, but we understand, or we got to look at the data, we understand, so let's try it again. And so the team has to rebuild the plan that we spent months building, and now we got to replan it. So there's execution shifts, there's replan shifts, and so it continues 24/7. We're just working on executing the mission and then updating the flight plan to as necessary to get all those mission objectives accomplished.
That's it. So when it comes to Judd, like all those things that are coming in, that are monitoring, really, let's just say like the avionics position, all the data is coming in, and they say, "Ooh, this is not what it's supposed to be," because I know what it's supposed to be at this. So this is where those replans, this is where those different operations come in that says, this is how we're going to deal with this scenario.
Yeah. So in your example, avionics person says, "Hey, I've got a computer that's throwing me a piece of information that's not right," or forbid that one of the computers has failed, completely. Yeah, so they'll say, "Hey, these are the things that we can do with it, to try to troubleshoot. These are the capabilities that we have lost. These are the capabilities that we still have." And so then you put that together with, well, what are the forward objectives that we have for the vehicle, coming up? Are they still compatible? Are we going to have to move those down the line a little bit further until we, completely troubleshoot what the problem is that you had in this particular system?
So when it comes in the room, the flight director, it sounds like, is the person that's really absorbing all the information from that avionics guy, from wherever, ground control, make sure all the satellites are working, make sure you got the systems in mission control. You're the one absorbing all of that information. Give us a lay of the land. So it sounds like if I were to look at a picture of mission control, you guys have rows of different flight controllers. You're in the back. You're listening to all this information. You're looking at a lot of data. What's sort of the lay of the land when it comes to mission control? Is it just the one room of people? What's happening in there?
Yeah, so for each one of those systems, flight controllers that represent a system on the vehicle, they have multiple support, people that they can call upon. Sometimes they'll usually have a back room, another person that's really in the down and in, detailed part of the system, whereas the flight controller out in the front room, they're more, they absolutely have that knowledge, but they're also looking to kind of integrate and try to understand how they're going to impact the other systems. In addition to the backroom support that they have, you have mission evaluation. You have engineers that have worked on the vehicle, have built, in many cases, built the vehicle. And so you can reach back and draw upon their experience to try and troubleshoot something that maybe you haven't seen before, or try to understand if, did we expect this, or was this a feature of the vehicle?
So you have the flight controllers, they have their own support networks. You got some engineering support, and if I'm understanding this correctly, all of that feeds up to the flight director.
Right.
Now the flight director, do they have the ultimate authority over the mission?
Absolutely. If everything goes as planned, we don't have to really, our job's very easy. We just let the team execute the timeline and get the data, and it's a great mission. But that's not very likely. So when things don't go as planned, then they look to the flight director to weigh the options. We understand the priorities that have been given to us from either the programs or ESD, and then we weigh the options based on inputs from the flight control team, their MIPSers, the engineering team. Program provides comments, and we ultimately have the responsibility to make a decision as to how to proceed from here. What's our next step?
Okay, and it's kind of like they're advisors. The flight controllers are sort of advisors to you, and you say, hey, Judd, this is happening. What should we do? And you're the one that has to make that ultimate decision, and that's the culture. The culture is a very hierarchical. It's very leadership. If you say that's what we're doing, that's what we're doing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, over the years, and the culture you mentioned, we've developed an incredible relationship across it's a family. So there's a trust factor that has been developed over the several years that we've been working together on this mission. It's a team effort to build the timeline, and then we go and train it. And we've been through all these scenarios that the training team has thrown at us, all these failures, and you learn how each other works. And so it's just amazing how it becomes a cohesive team and how it becomes easy. I mean, the hard part is, when you get two things that are just equal, how do you decide which way you want to go? And that's where the flight directors, come in and through experience, through, gut feeling sometimes, and through discussion amongst the team here, we talk amongst ourselves and try to figure out, weigh the options, but it's really the team effort that really helps us drive the decisions.
That trust factor seems super important too, because you have to rely. These are your advisors. They're making recommendations to you. You're the one that has to say this is what that is, and then they have to go execute it. But it has to go back to that training that you said. So there's this training. So Judd, what are you guys doing to train, to prepare all the different team members so that you can, when the moment comes, trust them?
Yeah. So I mean, back to the first point though too. It's not as if all situations are like that where we always have to kind of figure out what to do. We try to write a lot of those things down before the mission, right? We try to write down, what are the scenarios we think of? Let's say we lose this one piece of equipment. Can we continue on the mission? And we write those down in what are called flight rules. And those flight rules are pretty much a contract with the enterprise, the programs that say, hey, for these types of scenarios, we've kind of pre-thought those out beforehand, and so we all agree this is the avenue we're going to take, right? It's when we're outside of those kind of pre-thought out things is when what Rick's talking about a little bit there is that we talk about options. We talk about is there something that's in line with the philosophy of our mission rules, and so to your point on training, what we do in training is we present the flight controllers and the team with scenarios that are maybe right on the edge of, they're not exactly what the flight rules would say we would do. They're kind of in a little bit of a gray area, and so they push the boundaries, right? So that helps, our controllers be more of a methodical thinkers and talk about, what's the methodology, We have a mission rule that says we're going to do this X, but I mean, what happens if it's not exactly that, that exact, way of that the failure presents itself? What's really the intent? And that's really what we're trying to teach when we do these simulations, right? Is how do you not only communicate really effectively with not only your flight director, the rest of the team, but also how do you convey the intent of what previous mission rules have told you should be after? How do you convey that in a precise, concise, methodical manner?
So it's not only understanding the vehicle and understanding the operations, and it goes to your point. It goes beyond understanding just what happens in a normal scenario. You have these rules that are helping to guide your decisions and make the recommendations, all thought out ahead of time. That's awesome. But really what the training does is it helps you to think about that flight rule. How should I interpret that? Because it's not exactly within those parameters. So how can I interpret that? How can I make recommendations? But it sounds like communication is a huge piece of it too. Not only being able to digest the information, but to calmly and correctly assess and deliver that information to you, the flight director.
Yeah. When we evaluate a flight controller to be certified to operate their console for whatever specific phase of the mission, that is the first item that we evaluate is communication skills. Because without that, then they can't work as a team. They could be the smartest person in the room, smartest person of that system, and if they can't articulate that to the flight director, to other team members, their own team members, then it won't work. It just won't work. So that communications is paramount.
That is huge. Yeah. Okay, let's get into the Artemis mission. So we're going around the room. We're looking at all the different roles that have to contribute advice to you, the flight director. Judd, what are those roles? What are the in the room with you? What are the different flight control positions?
Yeah, so we start off in the ascent phase, and we have a little bit more flight controllers in the ascent phase than we do.
That's right. It's not just in the room, right?
Because we have a whole different other vehicle, right? We have actually 2 other vehicles with us. So we've got a booster that takes us up, and not only the SLS core stage, Space Launch System core stage, but we also have a second stage, which is the interim control propulsion module, the ICPS. And so I have a flight controller that represents the booster, right? And really, it's the booster. It's that first and second stage. So there's a booster flight controller, and he knows all about all of the, the cryogenics, the valves, the engine performance that's supposed to happen with all of the engines. But then I also have a control position who's really in charge of understanding how does that rocket, not only the core stage and the ICPS, how is that supposed to be controlled? What are the guidance, navigation, control inputs and outputs for the rockets, both the first stage and second stage. So in addition to that, I've got folks that are responsible for looking at the capsule, so the Orion capsule. Making sure that the systems are good on the Orion capsule, because eventually the rocket's going to drop Orion off, in translunar orbit, and we want to make sure that the capsule is still looking good as far as we can tell when it heads towards the moon. So as part of the capsule systems, we have a guidance, navigation, control officer, a GNC. Looking to make sure you know where you're at and you know how to get to where you want to go. We've got a flight trajectory officer, a FIDO, flight dynamics officer, and they're really in charge of, well, where is that place that you need to go, right? How do we get there? What's the correct burn trajectory? Where do we need to burn at what speed? And then we've also got for the other systems part, we've got an electrical officer who is not only electrical officer, but also is in charge of the mechanics part of the Orion vehicle as well. So it's a kind of a dual role of EPS, electrical power systems, and the mechanical. We call them an MPO. It's mechanical and power officer. Right, so they're advising us on all the solar array inputs from the service module that's connected to the Orion space capsule. They're advising us on the mechanical systems, so the pyrotechnics that have to be fired in order to make things move in all manners. We also have an environmental systems operator. Even though we don't have a full life support system on Orion for Artemis 1, we do have thermal control, and we've got we got somebody that needs to look after all of the thermal control aspects of that. And so that's the ECOM, environmental control officer. Obviously, we've got a ground control, person that's kind of in charge of all of the ground stations, communicating, when we need to get all the ground stations, at the right times. We've got a communication officer, INCO, which was what Rick was formerly a controller for back in the shuttle days. So they're in charge of all of the communications. And then we've got a CDH officer, a command and data handling officer, who's in charge of the avionics or the computers on board.
So, Rick, this makes me think about, you were talking about people and the communication skills and everything, because one thing that's going through my head is you have all these different, they sound very technical. You're getting the flight dynamics, you're thinking about trajectories, guidance, navigation, control, all these different systems of Orion and the boosters. There's got to be a reason why you can't just let data do the work and then it just gets fed to you and then you can make decisions. Why do you have to have all these different people?
Well, so we have a good idea through testing on how the systems are going to operate, but they're not going to operate exactly how they tested here on 1G on Earth. So the team is there to monitor and then control the system to make sure it's operating the way it's designed to and the way we need it to in order to execute the mission and achieve the objectives. If things go perfectly, there's an onboard sequencer that in a lot of ways will change the configuration of the systems as we go through the timeline. But it's very manual. Also, there's a lot of interaction that the team has to do. They have to be building commands continuously to configure the vehicle, their system, both pre-burn in order to execute the burn, and then post-burn, get back into the coast configuration. And so there's a lot of care and feeding that the team has to do. And that's one of the, I don't want to say it was a challenge, but one of the differences that in working with the Lockheed Martin, the prime contractor for Orion, is their expertise. Most of their experience base has been the uncrewed deep space probes, which were totally automated, right? So when you put humans on board, there's a whole new aspect. And so we've had to work with each other and learn how each other's works, to get along, and because there's dramatic differences in the way we operate. So the flight control team and mission control are really responsible for making sure the system operates the way it's supposed to.
So there's it goes beyond the data that's just being delivered. It goes into it sounds like it's like the interpretation of that data. Each system is wildly intricate in its own way. And you said each of them have different support networks too that are thinking about even more intricate details. And so you just need those levels of understanding to have that information be, so ultimately when it's delivered to you, the flight director, it is delivered by a human. That a human has digested of all the information, thought about it, they've studied, they've put in the work, and now they're the ones making the recommendation to you. You need that person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's true in most systems, when you cross boundaries, whether it's, it's an interface boundary, whether it's with hardware or with people, the greatest chance of you losing, either dropping communication or to get communication garbled, is those boundaries between two different systems or two different teams, right? And so that part is really what we need a human in the loop to help us out with, to interpret, what is the correct communication that needs to happen between these two things.
Yeah. A good example, there's going to be phases throughout the mission where whenever we do a major burn, we have to position the solar arrays into a position that will support the loading from the actual burning of the engine, and then also thermal from the thrusters that are fired. We want to protect them. And when we go to these positions, we're no longer generating power, or severely reduced power generation. So we have batteries on Orion that will then provide the systems, the battery. But depending on how long we're out of attitude, where those batteries are with respect to state of charge, we may not be able to handle the next worst failure, losing a battery. So we may have to do what would be called power downs or cross ties. And it's these flight controllers, the MPO officer, mechanical and power officer, who's going to have to come to us with recommendations on what should we do in order to configure the vehicle to ensure that we could successfully make it through this burn and ultimately achieve the objective.
Because it's not just about that next thing. That person is thinking about the step after that. Absolutely. And making sure, okay, what if I make this decision, how is that going to impact it downstream?
Yeah. Yep. We're really good about always thinking about the next worst failure and putting ourselves in a configuration that will be able to support that.
So, Rick, earlier on you mentioned, what is the purpose? What are we trying to accomplish for Artemis 1? And you said we've designed a mission profile for Artemis 1 that is going to help us to meet some objectives. So tell us a little bit about that profile. What is the booster, Orion? What is everything going to do to meet the objectives that you want to meet for this mission?
Yeah. Well, so it's two pieces. Let me start with, so we've done a lot of testing. There's a lot of analysis on how the system's are going to operate. What thermally, what's their boundaries? So the engineering team have done a lot of analysis. So they have a pretty good understanding. But without real data, there's a lot of margin in those analysis. And the analysis really, they put constraints on how we operate the vehicle. So most of the time, as we're coasting to the moon, we're tail to sun. So we're putting the rear end of Orion towards the sun, and the solar arrays are out parallel, and they're direct sunlight onto the arrays, generating as much power as we can. And if we were to leave that attitude, our rules right now, the analysis show we can leave it for 3 hours at a time, and then when we come back, we have to be in attitude for 10 hours to recover. Those are pretty significant constraints on if we wanted to do some other mission objective. This mission, the data, we're going to go out of attitude for periods of time. We're going to see how the systems respond. We're going to come back at attitude. We're going to see how long it recovers. So after our mission, all that data is going to be used to update the engineered models. So the next time we fly this vehicle with the astronauts on board, there'll be less conservatism in it. So it'll make it easier for us to be able to operate that vehicle. So that's kind of the big picture part of it.
Yeah.
The other piece, so ascent, obviously testing the rocket to make sure it can insert the vehicle and Orion into the right spot, and every mission has a different profile. So they're testing the performance of the rocket itself and the solid rocket boosters, and then the same thing with the upper stage. You know, it's going to be completely different on our mission, Artemis 1. It's going to do the translunar injection and send us on the way to the moon, but it's not going to do that for Artemis 2. It's going to put them in a high lunar orbit where they can test the systems out for 24 to 36 hours, I think, before they actually commit to the moon. And it'll be the service module that will actually do the last burn, TLI burn, to get Orion going to the moon. So we're testing the systems to prove that they're capable of doing what we need them to do when we put when astronauts on there. And then Orion itself, when we go to the moon, we're going to be using all the big engines, the OMS engine, which is the ones at the back end. That was actually a Heritage shuttle engine that we used on shuttle that have been used on Orion. And then it has the auxiliary thrusters. Those are our main means of doing large translational burns, or big burns, essentially. So we need to test the capability of those systems. And then on the way back, before we get back, there's a lot of pieces that need to operate. We have an optical nav system that is used to update the onboard nav state in the event that we lost comm, permanent loss of comm. The optical nav system actually could be used to update the onboard state vector, so that we could bring Orion back successfully. There's star trackers. There's all the thermal control system. We're going to be wringing out that system, testing where's the edges of the box. Really getting that engineering data so we can update our models and really understand how it works. And then one of the major pieces of the mission, one of the major objectives, is to test the heat shield, coming back at lunar velocities to make sure that it will support keeping Orion intact, and then so the astronauts can safely splash down coast of California.
Perfect. So this is definitely a mission to really, you said, put it through the ringer, to really wring out, test, push the limits of these vehicles. You really want to understand, because it sounds like you can't really do it on Earth. It sounds like this is something you have to test in space. All these the thrusters, you can put it in a sim as many times as you want, but when you actually put it in space, what's it going to do? Turning the solar rays away from the sun, not something you want to do, with humans on board, but let's test it out. Let's see if those limits are what we expect. You can only test it in space. That's really what it comes down to.
And you can only test it as an integrated vehicle, So one of the first things that they're going to test is going to do a modal test, to kind of vibrate the whole thing and see how everything shakes and make sure it doesn't shake itself to death, right?
Yeah.
And so you can only do that, when you're in space with the whole vehicle, right?
Without putting crew in danger. Test it now before you put the crew on board.
Right. And it's incremental steps too, right? I mean, you test this, you kind of get the data that you need to anchor all your engineering models, because their best guesses right now, and that's why Rick was talking earlier about how heavily constrained some of these things are. It's because from the engineering point of view, you just don't know how much of fidelity you have on the models, right? And so the way you anchor though is you get test data, and then all the way to the end, where you're making sure that whole capsule can come back, do a mission, come back safely, and be intact, so that you have high confidence that when you put humans and astronauts on board, that they'll come back, safely.
You mentioned earlier on, Rick, that it's a long day. The launch day is a long day. So let's jump there. Let's jump to launch day for Artemis 1. Judd, you're on first, right? Yep. So what are some of the first things that you're looking at on launch day for Artemis 1?
So, we start off the day, obviously, the launch team at Kennedy Space Center has prepped the vehicle. They've put it together. It's taken them months and months and months to put the vehicle together. They've loaded up all the fuel on board. They've started to turn on all the systems, so all of the lights come on, all of the computers come on. We start to get data. They start to get data. Once they're ready and they've met all of their constraints, they'll launch the vehicle and then hand it immediately over to my team. And of course, we'll be, following along with them lockstep, but we're more of advisors, when we're still on the ground. We're saying, this is how, if you had this failure here, this is how it would affect the mission going forward. But we're not really the prime folks that are going to save things or, troubleshoot or things like that. But as soon as the rocket's lit, then my team's in control. We're making sure that from the get-go that we're doing the right thing that we're supposed to do. We start that roll maneuver out and keep on going towards our max dynamic pressure throttle bucket. Once that's complete, that we're ejecting the solid rocket boosters. They do their job after about 2 minutes. And then we continue on with just the core stage engines. And we'll follow that all the way up to MECO, main engine cutoff of those 4 major engines. And then the ICPS plus the Orion service module and Orion capsule, they will separate from the core stage. The core stage will fall back to Earth in the ocean. And the ICPS and above will continue on, and the ICPS then goes and does a series of burns, and before it does its first burn, which it's perigee raise maneuver. So perigee is the closest approach to the Earth. When it does that before it does the burn to raise that altitude at perigee, we go ahead and deploy the solar arrays. So up until that point, the Orion spacecraft is on batteries this whole time through the mission. So at about 16-ish, 17 minutes or so, we start to deploy the solar arrays and make sure that they deploy first of all, and then that we can get them in the proper, as Rick was alluding to, the proper angles and sweep in order to do that first perigee raise maneuver burn that's going to be done by the ICPS.
ICPS is
It's the interim control propulsion module, so it's the second stage.
Second stage, okay.
Yep.
Cool.
And so that second stage burns PRM, and we go through another series of, ICPS takes us through a bunch of kind of roll maneuvers, just kind of to make sure that the thermal heating on all sides of the whole vehicle is heated and cooled equivalent. We start to use our ammonia boiler systems on the Orion spacecraft at that point to start cooling the interior. So we've got a heat exchanger that exchanges ammonia on the outside with the coolant loop, which is a glycol type coolant on the inside, and we make sure that we reject all the heat, that all the avionics and all of the interior part of the Orion is, and we make sure that that's working okay. And then eventually, about an hour and a half or so into the mission, we do the translunar injection burn with ICPS, that second stage. And hopefully that takes us on our trajectory to the moon.
There you go.
Right.
You have to activate the spacecraft, check everything out, make sure it is good to go before you get to that point.
Right.
At what point are you taking over, Rick?
Right after Orion separates, after the upper stage performs translunar injection, and then Orion pops off and does we're going to do a quick handover right then. Because right after that, Judd mentioned the modal survey. That's one of the first things we have to do. And it's just a series of RCS reaction controlled thruster firings. And we have accelerometers, and they're doing video, watching how the solar arrays are going to flap. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's some old video of a bridge, and I think it was in California, that the winds came by and it hit a resonant frequency, and it basically destroyed itself.
Was it the bridge that was sort of doing this sine wave kind of maneuver? Yes,
the
I have
winds
seen
caused
that.
it to hit a resonant frequency that caused it to basically self-destruct.
Oh.
We're testing the onboard system to make sure the gains on the control systems are set such that that doesn't happen.
Got it.
So we're going to do that quick test. Until we do that test, we're limited on how long of burns we can do. They can only be our ohms burn, the big engine. It would ultimately is going to get us to go into the distant retrograde orbit, 30 seconds, and that's not near long enough to do anything on our mission. So we got to get a good modal survey, and then also on my shift we will do the first. They're called outbound trajectory correction. They're correction burns. They're small burns, but the very first one we're actually going to go. It's going to be the ohms checkout burn. So we're going to burn that ohms engine for 30 seconds to make sure it's good to go because the first time we use it actually is for the outbound powered flyby, and that's setting us up to the distant retrograde orbit, and you want to make sure it works well. So it's going to test it there.
Got it.
So those are the primary things on flight day 1. And then after that, we do it's just a series of a couple days as we coast up to the outbound trajectory flyby. We have a couple trajectory correction maneuvers. We want to make sure when we go by the moon, which by the way, it's going to be around 60 miles off the surface of the moon.
Close.
Crazy. So we got to make sure we don't get too close, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what those trajectory correction maneuvers are really important. Targeting that outbound powered flyby, and then we'll burn that guy, and that'll take us up to the distant retrograde orbit where we're doing insertion. And depending on if we launch in November, it's around 14 days. I think we're up in that orbit. It's either half a lap or a lap and a half. So
got it.
And that's all. It depends on what time of the year we launch. And that's all to set up for lighting it at splashdown for Judd and the recovery team. We want it to be lit so that the recovery forces can watch the capsule come down, watch chutes deploy, just see how it functions, and then recover all the piece parts.
Lit meaning the sun is shining in the Pacific.
Shining in the Pacific.
sorry.
Yeah, off the coast of San Diego.
Yeah.
Right, off the coast of San Diego. There it is. So, and that burn happens at the moon.
It does.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
It's like what, 6 or 7 days before splashdown.
So it starts when we actually depart. It's DRD, distant retrograde departure burn, which starts heading us back to the moon, and then ultimately, where the shuttle used to have that deorbit burn. Our deorbit burn is actually happening as we go by the moon, and Judd's going to take that shift. So it targets the. But when we leave, the DRO actually sets up for when we're going to actually do that return powered flyby.
So before we head back to Earth and talk about some of the things there, what are some of the checkouts that are happening in the lunar vicinity?
Actually around the moon, it's very similar to the things we're doing on the way there and on the way back.
Oh, okay.
The optical nav system checkout.
Systems, yeah.
We have a series of payloads, it's called Callisto. It's a interactive where there's
oh, cool.
We're going to have people come into the control center in a special room where they actually will be able to talk to like an Alexa type.
Like an AI kind of voice.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
cool.
Yeah. So we have a series of those. We have a series of PAO events where we're doing taking Earth and moon shots as we leave.
Those will be really
closer.
cool.
One of the big things when we're in the DRO is to look for that first moonrise. That shot.
Earthrise.
Earthrise.
Yeah,
Earthrise.
that's a big one. Yeah.
So that is a big one. So and again, it's all testing the systems. We're doing different mode operations for the systems, like the radiators. We go to a flow control versus speed control, which is just a different mode of operating it, just to see how it's gonna operate.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So when we get to recovery, Judd, what are some of the key things that you're going to be looking for? We have spoilers with the heat shield. There's a couple of other things that you're going to be looking for. What are those key things?
Yeah. So once we're way back at the moon and we do the burn to get us out, we're looking for a very tight corridor for entry interface. It all has to do with the geometry and the speed and everything. If you're too shallow, you bore into the Earth too much, and you burn up the heat shield too much. If you're too shallow, then you'll skip off. If you go bore in too hard, then you have too much heating on the thermal.
It's like a Goldilocks zone
so
of
you're
approach.
trying to get right at the right part. We're also trying to do an objective where we get to a point where we do what's called a skip entry. We intentionally get at an angle where we skip a little bit and then come right back in, and that's in order so we get like a double heating profile, so that we test the heat shield to make sure if we ever want to do that, on future crewed flights, that we have that capability to have a double thermal, heat shield objective, so that it gives us more flexibility in future missions to have a different EI or quarter or EI constraints or entry interface constraints.
Okay, and you're doing that purposely for Artemis 1, just to test it, and then you won't do a skip entry unless, but now you know you can.
Now we know we can, So maybe if that, if the mission dictates it in the future years, we know that that the heat shield can take it, and that's exactly what we're looking for, right? We're looking to see how does the heat shield perform, so that we know for future missions, how do we modify or create those missions such that we take full advantage of the capability of the vehicle. So once we hit entry interface, we're pretty much along for the ride. It's really quick from there. It's about 20 minutes until we splash down from entry interface. Obviously, we're looking to make sure that all of the systems come online. We have baro altimeters that tell us, what the altitude is, because you need to deploy your drogue chutes and your main chutes at certain altitudes, and that's heavily reliant on what altitude, what pressure that the atmosphere is at that determines the altitude. And we have GPS receivers that come on that also tell us that. Not only tells us altitude in addition to what the baro altimeters tell us, but also tells us where we're at. And so kind of how do we steer ourselves into the wind as we're coming in, right?
Cool.
And so we're making sure that all of those systems come online properly and are able to meet the demands of the splashdown.
That is quite a mission. There's a lot to that. When you're looking at it and looking at what there's left to do to build up to this moment, what do you guys still have to work on from now, the time that we're recording this, to when we actually are ready to go on the launch pad for Artemis 1? What's there left to do?
Probably the most significant thing is to train the team and certify the team to be ready to execute the mission.
Okay.
As we do that, though, we're refining our rules. Jed talked about the flight rules, our contract with the programs and the enterprise. We're learning as they test the vehicle and they're assembling it out at KSC. They're testing it. We're learning idiosyncrasies of it that may affect our rules on the way we're going to operate it. So we're training, certifying the team, and we're making sure our products are ready to go. Those are the primary objectives I've thought.
Yeah, and I would say in addition to that, so up to this point, the individual teams have trained together really well. Like, so for instance, the flight control team in Houston, we've done a lot of simulations, and Rick talked about those together just as a Houston team. Down at KSC, the launch team has done a lot of training events for just that launch team. The mission evaluation, the engineering guys, they've trained individually. So what we're really focusing on now is making sure all of those teams come together and function as a cohesive unit, right? Yeah. The recovery team, so they know that we're all on the same page. The launch team, we know. So it basically becomes a seamless end-to-end mission that starts with the folks at Kennedy Space Center, transitions over to us at Johnson, and then back, at that splashdown in San Diego to the folks at Kennedy, and with the help of our Navy friends.
It all works together.
Yeah,
we refer to those as joint integrated simulations, and we're also taking advantage of a lot of the things they are already planned down at KSC, like when they do a wet just rehearsal or a pre-launch sim. Judd and his team will be on console just to continue to build these relationships, in the flight environment. So it really is very important to a successful.
It's all coming up real soon, and it sounds like you guys have a lot that you need to focus on, a lot to do, but when it comes down to it, we're doing a mission to the moon, around the moon. We're going to see Earthrise. We're going to see a lot of cool stuff. When you look at it, Rick, what are you looking forward to most?
Wow, that's a good question. Just the whole experience of leaving low Earth orbit. I've been doing this, as I said, 36 years, and all of it's been low Earth orbit until now. And I was mentioning to Judd that I'm every bit as excited about this mission as I was the first day I walked in the doors, coming out of college. Walking in the mission control for the first time. It's there's a lot of responsibility, so I'm going to be really, really nervous. But,
Yeah.
But just the team is amazing. That we've got so much support from across the globe, really. It's going to be so exciting. It's going to be hard to contain myself.
Very cool. Judd, what about you?
I'm really looking forward to splashdown right off San Diego, and it's not so much that it's the end of a mission; it's the beginning of a campaign, right? It's the beginning of a campaign of re-engaging that pushing the boundaries of human exploration to go to the moon and beyond to Mars.
Beautiful. And we'll end it right there. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for coming on Houston We Have a Podcast. What a cool discussion. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Thanks
for having us.
For all mankind.
It's actually a huge honor to break a record like this.
Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Never Houston, welcome to space.
Subscribe for more space.